Hi, I'm Chris. Today I'm going to be refuting Saket, and his claim was climate change is a threat that must be addressed. His secondary claims were climate change will increase the risk of storms, droughts, and floods. The second one was climate change will negatively affect the economy in the long run. And the third one is that climate change is a threat that will increase the death rates. My three main responses to these claims is that for the first one, his first secondary claim does not have sufficient evidence, and the sources used undermines his claims. The second one is that the reasoning process behind the claim is flawed and does not include data to back up the reasoning. And the third one is that the evidence presented was insufficient and deems the argument unreliable. For the first response to his claim, his first secondary claim, which was climate change will increase risk of storms, droughts, and floods, is that his claims cited an article, Extreme Weather by National Climate Assessment, and gave an example of the most recent drought recorded to be in Texas and Oklahoma, where they had 100 days of 100-degree weather. This example used is generalizing two cases over 7 years ago, claiming this is why climate change is intensifying droughts, storms, and floods across the world. There are simply not enough examples presented to conclude that the whole world will be at a higher risk for natural disasters. With further research on the same article that was cited earlier, it claims that since 1991, the amount of rain falling and heavy precipitation events have been above average in areas like the Midwest, such as Texas and Oklahoma. This reported information contradicts the earlier statement that increasing droughts have been in this area, because one says that these areas are experiencing long span droughts, and then a few paragraphs later it says that the same areas have been seeing increased rain downpour. So first off, it has insufficient evidence, and then the sources used were undermining the claim. For the second response for the second secondary claim, which was climate change will negatively affect the economy in the long run, he claims that according to an article by The Bounce, which is a website about personal finance, that has reported damage costs due to natural disasters. Although this evidence may be factual and correct, this information does not support his main claims that climate change will hurt the economy, because there is no backing that these damage costs are a result of climate change. The inference that can be made from this is that if there was no climate change, there would not be any damage costs due to these events. But on the contrary, natural disasters have been causing extreme damage since the existence of the Earth. So that claim that the economy will be negatively affected by climate change is not reasonable, because natural disaster would still exist and cause the same amount of damage, resulting in the same cost. This claim starts off saying that true economic impact of climate change is hard to predict. So it's already starting off saying that what he's gonna give is not necessarily true, but it's an assumption. And then he proceeds to make a number of chain claims, all based on that assumption that it is safe to predict the claim. There is no factual data presented showing the correlation between climate change and economic downfall. The response to the third secondary claim, which was climate change is a threat that will increase the death rates, it first states that climate change will increase the death rates. This claim cites the World Health Organization with a statistic saying that the Earth has increased temperature by 0.85 degrees Celsius over 3 decades. When analyzing the cited data presented, it only shows the portion of where the temperature has increased over those 3 decades. What was not presented was the years preceding, showing similar spikes of heat increase similar to those of current years, meaning that the Earth has seen patterns of heat increase and decrease since its existence. To claim that this is a major threat to the world is unreasonable due to the fact that similar trends of temperature rise have been seen since the beginning of mankind. This information shows that there was insufficient evidence presented and is unreliable to argue that increased temperature will be a major threat to humanity. There was no connection made between the climate change and death rates increasing. In conclusion, although it may be controversial whether climate change is a threat that must be addressed, there is nothing in my opponent's presentation that proves it should be one way or the other. By looking into the evidence and reasoning behind his arguments, it was found that the claims were insufficient and unreliable. Thank you.
All right, Chris, you preview the advocate's claims, then you preview your responses to the claims, and then you present the claims again. It's too much. Remind us what the main points are, and then give us what your counterclaim is going to be as you get to each of those points. That'll be simpler and more direct. Two previews are not necessary. Previewing what their arguments are, and then previewing what your arguments are just seems redundant at the beginning of the speech. You're relatively clear on what your arguments are on the individual points, suggesting that they haven't really provided sufficient information. I like the information on the drought argument, for instance, to say the example that the advocate cites is a drought in Texas and Oklahoma. That's from 7 years ago. The data is a little bit inconsistent old. Plus, we've seen information that suggests that the rainfall has been above average as a result of supposed climate change. So there's what we have, we call it internal inconsistency. The advocate's own source offers information that contradicts the claim that the advocate is presenting. And we don't know which conclusion to draw from that particular point. If that's the only evidence that they had on that point, I think that's the other thing that you want to emphasize is the only data that they supplied on this particular point was the drought information. And the truth of the matter is, like you said, we've had these kinds of events forever, which is kind of what you get into in the second point when you're talking about the economic costs. I do think there's an argument to be made on the first point, too, that we have these sorts of events for all kinds of reasons, and there are patterns of them, and the idea that they're all related to climate change hasn't been very well documented. I think you could use a good counterclaim on something like that. But you're doing a good job pressing the arguments that are being presented. The reasoning on this point, I think, is challenged because it's pretty straightforward. You're saying this presumes that all of these damages were caused as a result of climate change, and there's no demonstration that that is the case. So you can't really make that conclusion that these costs are the way that we're going to measure that. And in fact, the advocate's own evidence seems to suggest that we can't really predict those kinds of things. I thought that was a pretty good, pointing out, again, a piece of information in the advocate's argument. That was straightforward. And then the third argument seems to depend on a piece of information that is only vaguely being presented here, and that is the patterns of weather change that have occurred before this WHO report, for instance. And I think you need to cite the source there and give us a direct quote. That's a little unclear. You in essence say, his argument's based on a chain here, and the premise of the chain is not valid. But your argument that proves the premise of the chain is not valid, I think, is not cited very clearly on that argument. Lots of reading going on here. You need to talk to us a little bit more. All right, thank you.